The buttons scattered across my kitchen table like fallen tears, each one catching the afternoon light streaming through my window. I'm 83 years old now, my hands wrinkled as old parchment. But as I touch that familiar brass button, the one with the tiny rose etched into its surface, I'm 11 again, trembling behind a faded curtain, listening to my mother's gentle voice. Life is made of scraps, Gertrude. It's up to us to sew these scraps in the best way possible. If only she had known then what scraps her daughter would have to piece together. My name is Gertrude Ann Jenkins, and for 72 years, I've carried a secret so heavy it nearly broke me. But today, sitting in my quiet house in Atlanta, surrounded by photographs of my children and grandchildren, safe loved, protected, I finally understand what my mother meant about those scraps. Sometimes the most beautiful quilts are made from the darkest pieces of fabric. This is the story of how a simple box of buttons became my map to freedom, and how the most devastating betrayal led to the most profound healing. But to tell it properly, I must take you back to Milltown, North Carolina, where the cotton fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and where innocence could be shattered with a whisper. The morning everything changed started like any other in the summer of 1952. The air hung thick and humid over our little house on the outskirts of town, where the peach trees drooped heavy with fruit, and the blackberry bushes grew wild along the fence line. I was helping Mama sort through her sewing box on the front porch, our bare feet dangling over the weathered wooden planks that Papa had painted white 3 summers ago, but were now gray with age and weather. The box was a treasure chest to me. An old cigar box covered in faded blue fabric, filled with buttons that gleamed like jewels threads in every color imaginable, and fabric scraps that held the stories of our town's finest families. Mama's fingers, calloused from years of needlework, moved through the contents with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics. "Tell me about this one again," I said, holding up a mother-of-pearl button that caught the light like moonbeams on water. It was perfectly round, smooth as silk, with 4 small holes that formed a delicate cross pattern. Mama smiled that gentle expression that made her weathered face beautiful, despite the premature lines etched by hard work and worry. "That came from Mrs. Whitmore's wedding dress, child. She was the banker's daughter, married young Mr. Patterson from Charlotte back in '38. Such a beautiful ceremony, the whole church was filled with white roses, and she looked like an angel walking down that aisle." I closed my eyes, imagining myself in that dress, walking down the aisle of our little Baptist church, while the congregation watched in admiration. In my daydreams, I was always somewhere else, someone else, anyone but Gertrude Jenkins, the only girl in a house full of boys, daughter of a mill worker and a seamstress who could make miracles from scraps, but couldn't make enough money to keep us from going to bed hungry some nights. "And this green one?" Mama continued, picking up a button carved from what looked like jade, came from Mrs. Marlowe's evening gown. She wore it to the governor's ball in Raleigh, must have been 5 years ago now. Said it made her feel like royalty. "And this gold one, Mr. Jameson's wedding vest. The pharmacist, you know. His bride insisted on the finest buttons she could find, ordered them special from Charleston. Cost more than your father makes in a week, I'd wager." Each button held a story, a connection to a world beyond our humble circumstances. Through Mama's tales, I could glimpse lives of elegance and refinement, parties in grand houses' dresses that cost more than our entire yearly income. It was my first taste of literature, really, these small narratives woven around objects that had witnessed moments of joy and celebration. "Someday," I whispered, running my finger over the mother-of-pearl button, "I'll have a dress fine enough for buttons like these." Mama's smile grew tender. "Someday, you will, sugar. You've got the mind for it, the determination. Miss Ordway tells me you're the smartest student she's ever taught. Says you could go to college if you wanted, maybe become a teacher yourself." The idea seemed as impossible as flying to the moon. Girls like me didn't go to college. We grew up married, young, had babies, and spent our lives washing clothes and cooking meals and mending the same tired dresses year after year. But somewhere deep in my heart, a small flame of hope flickered whenever Mama spoke of possibilities beyond Milltown's boundaries. Trudy. The voice that called from inside the house made my blood run cold. Even now, decades later, I can still hear the particular way Jeremiah said my name, like he owned it, like he owned me. There was something in his tone that made my skin crawl, a possessiveness that had nothing to do with brotherly affection. My oldest brother appeared in the doorway, all 16 years of him filling the frame like a thundercloud blocking the sun. To everyone else in Milltown, Jeremiah was golden, smart, charming, destined for great things. Papa's favorite, Mama's pride, the boy who could fix anything with his hands and charm anyone with his smile. He was tall for his age, with broad shoulders from working at the textile mill, and the kind of easy confidence that made people listen when he spoke. His hair was the color of wheat in summer, always perfectly combed despite the heat and humidity. His eyes were the same blue as a Carolina sky, and when he smiled, which he did, often people couldn't help but smile back. But I knew the darkness that lived behind those bright blue eyes. I had seen it growing for months now, like a cancer eating away at whatever goodness had once existed in my brother's heart. "Come help me with something in the shed," he said, his voice honey-sweet, but his eyes cold as winter stones. He was wearing his work clothes overalls over a white cotton shirt that Mama had washed and pressed that morning. In his hand, he carried a small canvas bag that clinked softly as he moved. My mother looked up from her sewing, squinting against the morning sun. "What do you need help with, son?" "Just some heavy boxes I need to move around. Tools and such. Won't take but a minute." His smile was perfect, practiced the same one that made the mill foreman praise his work ethic and the preacher commend his helpfulness around the church. I felt my hands begin to shake, the precious buttons slipping from my fingers and rolling across the porch boards with a soft, clicking sound. It came to rest against the railing, glinting in the sunlight like a fallen star. I'm helping Mama with the sewing," I stammered, desperation creeping into my voice. "The sewing can wait," Jeremiah said, his smile never wavering, but something dangerous flickering in his expression, a tightening around his eyes that I had learned to recognize and fear. "Can't it, Mama?" "Of course," she replied absently, already focused back on her work fingers, sorting through a collection of brass buttons that had come from a military uniform. "Go help your brother Gertrude, and don't dawdle. I need to start dinner soon, and these hems won't finish themselves." I wanted to scream, to grab Mama's arm, and tell her what her golden boy really was. The words burned in my throat like acid begging to be released, but fear held them prisoner, along with shame and the terrible certainty that no one would believe me even if I found the courage to speak. Who would take the word of an 11-year-old girl over Jeremiah's? He was the responsible one, the helpful one, the son who brought home steady wages and never caused trouble. I was just a child prone to flights of fancy, always reading books and making up stories. If I accused him of the things he did to me in the darkness of that shed, they would think I was lying. Or worse, they might think I had somehow encouraged it. As I stood on unsteady legs, the world seeming to tilt around me, I caught sight of Oscar watching from behind the kitchen window. My second oldest brother had been different lately, quieter, more watchful. Sometimes I caught him staring at Jeremiah with an expression I couldn't read, something between suspicion and disgust. Oscar was 14, stockier than Jeremiah, but just as strong from his work helping local farmers during harvest season. Where Jeremiah was all charm and easy smiles, Oscar was serious, thoughtful, the kind of boy who observed everything and spoke only when he had something important to say. His dark hair was usually tousled, his clothes practical and worn, and his brown eyes held a depth that suggested he understood more about the world's darkness than most boys his age. For a moment, our eyes met through the glass, and I thought I saw something there, understanding, maybe even anger. My heart leaped with hope. Did he know? Had he figured out what was happening? But then he looked away, and hope died in my chest like a candle snuffed out by wind. The walk to the shed felt like a journey to the gallows. Each step on the packed dirt path echoed in my ears like thunder. My legs felt weak, trembling like those of a newborn calf. The morning air, which had seemed so sweet and clean just moments before, now felt thick and suffocating. The shed sat at the far edge of our property, hidden behind a grove of peach trees that should have been beautiful, but now seemed like prison bars. It was a simple structure built by Papa and the older boys from salvaged lumber and corrugated tin. Inside it housed his tools, some stored grain, and potato sacks that would feed us through the winter. It should have been just a normal farm building, but for me it had become a chamber of horrors. "Please!" I whispered as Jeremiah's hand closed around my thin wrist, his fingers like iron bands. "Please don't!" He paused at the shed door, and for one heartbreaking moment, I thought I saw my real brother flickering in his face, the boy who used to carry me on his shoulders when I was small, who taught me to whistle, who once picked wildflowers for my hair just to see me smile. But then the mask slipped back into place colder than before. "You know what happens when you make me angry, Trudy," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow more terrifying than if he had shouted. "You know what happens when you tell stories." The shed door swung shut behind us with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the boards, creating bars of light and shadow across the dirt floor. The air smelled of dust and potatoes and something else, fear maybe, or shame. My shame. "Please, Jeremiah." I tried again, backing against the rough wooden wall. "Mama will wonder where we are. She's expecting us back soon." He laughed, a sound that had once filled me with joy, but now made my skin crawl. "Mama won't wonder about anything. She trusts me, Trudy. Everyone trusts me. And why shouldn't they? I'm the good son, the responsible one. I work hard. I don't cause trouble. I take care of my family." He stepped closer, and I could smell the soap he'd used that morning, mixed with the scent of his work at the mill. How could someone who looked so clean, so normal, harbor such darkness inside? "You wouldn't want to disappoint Mama, would you?" He continued, his voice taking on that reasonable tone he used when explaining things to our younger brothers. "She has such high hopes for our family. It would break her heart to know that her only daughter was telling lies about her oldest son." "I haven't told any lies." I whispered, my back pressed against the wall so hard I could feel the rough boards through my thin cotton dress. "No. Then why do you look so guilty? Why do you flinch every time I come near you? People might start to wonder what you're hiding, little sister. They might start to think you're not as innocent as you pretend to be." And then his hands were on me, and the world disappeared into a nightmare of pain and humiliation, and the terrible understanding that the person who was supposed to protect me had become my greatest threat. What happened in that shed is something I've spent a lifetime trying to forget, but memory has a way of preserving our worst moments with crystal clarity while letting the good ones fade. I remember the feeling of dirt under my fingernails as I clawed at the floor. I remember the sound of my own whimpering, pathetic and animal-like. I remember the way the sunlight continued to stream through the gaps in the boards, indifferent to the horror unfolding below. Most of all, I remember the moment when it ended, when Jeremiah straightened his clothes and looked down at me crumpled on the ground like a broken doll. His face was calm, almost serene, as if nothing had happened at all. "If you tell anyone," he said, his voice conversational, "no one will believe you. And if they do believe you, they'll say it was your fault. They'll say you encouraged it, that you wanted it. Is that what you want people to think about you, Trudy? That you're that kind of girl?" I couldn't speak, couldn't even nod. My throat felt raw. My body ached in ways I didn't understand, and my soul felt like it had been torn in half. Good girl," he said, patting my head like I was a dog that had learned a new trick. "Now clean yourself up and come back to the house. And remember, this is our special secret. Brothers and sisters have special secrets sometimes." When he left, I dragged myself to the corner where Papa kept a bucket of clean water for washing tools. I scrubbed my hands and face, trying to wash away the feel of his touch, the smell of his skin, the memory of what he had done. But no amount of water could cleanse the shame that had settled into my bones like a disease. I don't know how long I stayed in that shed, curled up in the corner like a wounded animal. It might have been minutes or hours. Time had lost all meaning. Eventually, I heard Mama calling for me from the house, her voice carrying across the yard with growing concern. "Gertrude, where are you? Child, dinner's almost ready. Way." I forced myself to stand, though my legs shook like autumn leaves in the wind. I smoothed my dress, tried to arrange my hair, and practiced smiling in case anyone looked too closely at my face. Then I walked back to the house, each step requiring all my willpower. Jeremiah was already at the dinner table talking animatedly with Papa about some project at the mill. He looked up when I entered, gave me that perfect smile, and said, "There you are, Trudy. Thanks for helping me move those potato sacks. I couldn't have managed without you." Everyone smiled and nodded, accepting his story without question. Why wouldn't they? Jeremiah never lied. Jeremiah was helpful and responsible and good. I took my place at the table and tried to eat, though the food tasted like sawdust in my mouth. Oscar kept glancing at me with those watchful eyes, and once he asked, "You feeling all right, Gertrude? You look pale." "Just tired," I mumbled, not meeting his gaze. "Growing girls need their rest," Mama said, reaching over to feel my forehead. "You don't have a fever, but maybe you should lie down after dinner." I nodded, grateful for any excuse to escape to my corner behind the faded curtain. But as I prepared for bed that night, changing into my cotton nightgown by lamplight, I caught sight of my reflection in Mama's small mirror. The girl looking back at me seemed different somehow. Older, sadder, marked by something that couldn't be washed away with soap and water. That was the night I learned that innocence once lost can never be recovered. That was the night I discovered that the people we love most can sometimes hurt us deepest. And that was the night I began to understand that surviving meant learning to live with secrets that felt too big for my small body to contain. But what I didn't know then, as I lay awake, listening to the sounds of my family sleeping peacefully around me, was that this was only the beginning. I thought Jeremiah had taken what he wanted and would leave me alone now. I thought the nightmare was over. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about so many things. The weeks that followed taught me new lessons about fear and shame and the weight of silence. Jeremiah's attacks for, "That's what they were, though," I wouldn't have the words to call them that for years, became more frequent, more brazen. He developed an uncanny ability to know when we would be alone when Mama and Papa were occupied elsewhere, when my other brothers were out of the house. Sometimes he would send me on errands that took me near the shed, then appear, as if by coincidence, to help me carry whatever I'd been sent to fetch. Other times he would wait until everyone was asleep, then creep to my corner and wake me with a hand over my mouth and threats whispered in my ear. "Remember," he would always say afterward, "this is our special secret, and good girls keep secrets." I tried to avoid being alone, but in a house as small as ours, with so many chores to be done and so many responsibilities shared among the children, it was impossible. There was always wood to be fetched, laundry to be hung, vegetables to be gathered from the garden. And Jeremiah was always there, watching, waiting, ready to turn any moment of solitude into another nightmare. At school, my grades began to slip. I had always been Miss Ordway's star pupil, the girl who finished her lessons early and begged for extra books to read. But now, I couldn't concentrate, couldn't focus on anything beyond the fear that lived in my chest like a caged animal. Miss Ordway noticed, of course. She was the kind of teacher who truly saw her students, who paid attention to changes in behavior and performance. She was in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She had never married, dedicating her life instead to education and the belief that knowledge could lift anyone out of poverty and despair. "Gertrude," she said one afternoon as I lingered after class staring blankly at an arithmetic problem I couldn't solve, "is everything all right at home?" I looked up at her face, round and gentle, lined with laugh lines from years of smiling at children's antics and accomplishments. She was the closest thing to an angel I'd ever known, lending me books from her personal collection, staying after school to help with difficult lessons, always believing I could be more than just another mill worker's daughter. "Yes, ma'am." I lied the words, tasting like ashes in my mouth. "Just tired, I suppose." She studied me with those sharp eyes that missed nothing, taking in my pallor, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I seemed to shrink into myself. "You know, Gertrude, sometimes, when we're troubled, it helps to talk about it. I've found that secrets have a way of growing heavier the longer we carry them alone." For a moment, I was tempted to tell her everything. The words crowded in my throat, begging to be released. But then, I remembered Jeremiah's warnings, his certainty that no one would believe me, and the moment passed. "I'm fine, Miss Ordway, really." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded and let me go. That was the way things worked in 1952. Adults suspected that children might be troubled, but they rarely pushed for details. Some doors were meant to stay closed, some truths too ugly to be spoken aloud. At home, the atmosphere grew stranger by the day. I wasn't the only one who had noticed changes in our family dynamic. Oscar, in particular, seemed increasingly agitated, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by a restless energy that made everyone nervous. "What's got into you lately?" Papa asked him one evening as we sat around the dinner table. Oscar had been pushing his food around his plate without eating, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the kitchen window. "Nothing," Oscar replied, but his voice was tight with suppressed emotion. "Don't look like nothing to me," Papa persisted. "You've been jumpy as a cat in a thunderstorm for weeks now." Oscar's gaze flicked to Jeremiah, then to me, then back to his plate. "Just thinking about things." "What kind of things?" "Family things. Making sure everyone's safe." The word hung in the air like smoke from Papa's pipe. Jeremiah's jaw tightened, and I saw his hands clench into fists on the table. But before he could respond, little George piped up with some story about catching fireflies in the yard, and the moment passed. But the tension remained crackling between my older brothers like electricity before a storm. I began to notice that Oscar made a point of being around whenever Jeremiah was home. If I was hanging laundry and Jeremiah appeared to help, Oscar would materialize moments later with some excuse about needing to check the clothesline. If I was in the garden and Jeremiah approached, Oscar would suddenly remember that he needed to weed the vegetable patch. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but as the pattern continued, I began to wonder if somehow impossibly, Oscar knew what was happening. The hope that thought brought was almost painful in its intensity. If Oscar knew if he was trying to protect me, then maybe I wasn't as alone as I felt. But that hope was tempered by confusion and hurt. If Oscar knew, why didn't he do something more direct? Why didn't he confront Jeremiah? Why didn't he tell our parents? The questions tormented me, but I didn't dare ask them. I didn't dare risk the fragile protection his presence provided. One night, unable to sleep for the weight of my thoughts, I crept to the kitchen window and peered out into the yard. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light, and I could see two figures standing near the old oak tree that grew beside the barn. Even from a distance, I recognized them immediately, Jeremiah and Oscar facing each other like gunfighters preparing for a duel. I eased the window open a crack, just enough to catch fragments of their conversation on the night breeze. "Won't stand for it much longer," Oscar was saying, his voice low but fierce. "Won't stand for what?" Jeremiah's tone was mocking, challenging. "You don't know anything." "I know enough. I've seen the way she looks at you now, the way she flinches when you come near. I'm not blind, Jeremiah." "What you think you see and what's actually happening are two different things. Maybe you should mind your own business." "She is my business. She's our sister." Jeremiah laughed, that cold sound that made my blood freeze. "Is that what this is about? You think you're some kind of knight in shining armor? Let me tell you something, little brother. You don't have the stomach for what it takes to stop me. You never did." "Try me?" They circled each other slowly, and I held my breath, terrified that at any moment one of them would strike. But then Jeremiah said something that made my world tilt on its axis. "You think you're protecting her? You think you're so much better than me, but I know the truth, Oscar. I know what you think about when you look at her. I know what you want." Oscar went very still. "You're sick. Am I, or am I just honest about things you're too cowardly to admit?" "She's growing up, Oscar. Becoming a woman. And she's pretty, isn't she? Those big green eyes, that sweet smile. Sometimes I catch you watching her when she doesn't know it. Tell me you've never wondered what it would be like to—" "Shut up." Oscar's voice was deadly quiet. "You have, haven't you? You've thought about it. The only difference between us is that I have the courage to take what I want while you just stand there wanting and never acting. Who's the real coward here?" That's when Oscar struck his fist, connecting with Jeremiah's jaw with a sound like breaking wood. But Jeremiah was ready for him, had probably been goading him toward this moment. They went down together, rolling in the dust, grunting and cursing, and trying to destroy each other with their bare hands. I wanted to scream, to run outside and stop them, but fear kept me frozen at the window. This fight wasn't really about me, I realized with sick understanding. It was about power, about dominance, about two young men trying to establish their place in the hierarchy of our small world. The fight ended as suddenly as it had begun. They separated, both breathing hard, both marked with cuts and bruises. Jeremiah wiped blood from his split lip and smiled. "Feel better now?" he asked conversationally. Oscar didn't answer, just stared at his older brother with an expression of pure hatred. "Good," Jeremiah continued, "because now we understand each other. You can play the protective brother all you want, but we both know the truth. And if you ever try to interfere with my business again, I'll make sure everyone else knows it too." He walked away, then leaving Oscar standing alone under the oak tree. My second oldest brother stayed there for a long time. His head bowed, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or rage or both. I crept back to my corner behind the curtain, my mind reeling with what I had witnessed. Everything I thought I understood about my family, about the complex dynamics between my brothers, had been turned upside down. Oscar wasn't just trying to protect me. He was fighting his own demons, his own shameful desires that Jeremiah had somehow detected and weaponized. The realization filled me with a despair so profound, I thought it might swallow me whole. If Oscar was struggling with his own dark impulses, if even he couldn't be trusted completely, then I truly was alone in this nightmare. But I was wrong about that too. So very wrong. The next few days passed in a strange, tense calm. Both Jeremiah and Oscar bore the marks of their fight, Jeremiah with his split lip and bruised cheek, Oscar with scraped knuckles and a blackened eye. When asked, they both claimed to have fallen while working, and our parents accepted the explanation with the resignation of people who had learned not to ask too many questions about their son's activities. But I noticed changes in both of them. Jeremiah seemed more reckless, more bold in his approaches to me. It was as if the confrontation with Oscar had removed some internal restraint, freed him to pursue his twisted desires with even less caution. Oscar, meanwhile, had withdrawn into himself, speaking only when necessary and avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially me. The breaking point came on a sweltering afternoon in late August. Mama had sent me to the shed to retrieve a sack of potatoes for dinner, and I had been standing at the door for several minutes, gathering the courage to enter that place of nightmares. I knew Jeremiah was somewhere on the property. I had seen him near the barn just a few minutes earlier, and the thought of being trapped in that enclosed space filled me with panic. Having trouble with the door, I spun around to find Oscar approaching, his face carefully neutral. He looked older than his 14 years, aged by whatever private battle he had been fighting since that night under the oak tree. I just need to get some potatoes," I stammered. He studied me for a moment, and I saw something shift in his expression, a kind of recognition, as if he was finally seeing me clearly for the first time. "You're afraid of him," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I wanted to deny it, to protect the fragile facade of normalcy that held our family together. But something in Oscar's tone, the gentleness I heard there, made the truth spill out of me like water from a broken dam. "Yes," I whispered, "I'm afraid." He nodded, as if confirming something he had long suspected. "What has he done to you, Gertrude?" The question hung between us, heavy with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to voice. But Oscar's eyes held no judgment, no suspicion, only a fierce protectiveness that I had been longing to see. "Things," I said finally. "Bad things, in the shed. He says if I tell, no one will believe me. He says they'll think it's my fault." Oscar's face went white, then red, then white again. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment I thought he might hit something, the shed door, the fence post, anything to release the rage I saw building in him. "How long?" he asked through gritted teeth. "Since June, maybe before. I lost track." And I knew he said more to himself than to me. God help me, I knew something was wrong, and I didn't stop it soon enough. "You tried," I said, remembering all the times he had appeared when Jeremiah was near, all the moments when his presence had kept me safe. "You've been trying to protect me." "Well, not enough. Not nearly enough." He looked at me with eyes full of pain and determination. "It ends now, Gertrude. Today. I promise you that." "What are you going to do?" "Whatever it takes." Before I could ask what he meant, we heard footsteps approaching. Jeremiah appeared around the corner of the shed, that familiar smile playing around his lips when he saw us together. "Well, well," he said cheerfully. "Brother and sister having a little chat. How sweet." Oscar stepped in front of me, his body forming a barrier between Jeremiah and the shed door. "She doesn't need to go in there today." "Oh, but she does," Jeremiah replied, his smile widening. "Mama specifically asked for potatoes, and it would be disappointing to let Mama down, wouldn't it, Trudy?" "I'll get the potatoes," Oscar said firmly. "No, I think Trudy can manage. She's a big girl now. Aren't you, Trudy, capable of handling all sorts of responsibilities?" The way he said the word responsibilities made my skin crawl. Oscar must have heard it too, because he took a step forward, his hands clenched. "Leave her alone, Jeremiah. Or what, you'll fight me again. We both know how that turned out." Jeremiah's smile never wavered, but his eyes had gone cold and hard. "Besides, this is between Trudy and me. Family business." "She's family to me, too." "Is she?" "Sometimes I wonder if your interest in our little sister is entirely brotherly." The accusation hung in the air like a poison cloud. I saw Oscar flinch as if he'd been slapped, saw the shame and guilt that Jeremiah's words conjured in his eyes. It was a masterful manipulation, using Oscar's own fears and uncertainties against him. But something had changed in Oscar since our conversation moments earlier. Instead of retreating, instead of letting Jeremiah's taunts drive him away, he stood his ground. "You're right," he said quietly. "Sometimes my feelings about Gertrude aren't entirely brotherly. Sometimes I look at her and see not just my sister, but a beautiful young woman. Sometimes I have thoughts that shame me." Jeremiah's smile widened, thinking he had won. "But you know what the difference is between us," Oscar continued. "I'm ashamed of those thoughts. They horrify me. They make me want to be better to protect her from anyone who might hurt her, including myself. You, on the other hand, you're proud of your sickness. You celebrate it. You use it to hurt someone smaller and weaker than yourself." "How noble!" Jeremiah sneered. "Saint Oscar, protector of innocence. But we both know the truth." "The truth," Oscar interrupted, "is that you're a predator, and predators need to be stopped." That's when I saw what Oscar had been hiding behind his back, one of Papa's tools, a heavy wrench used for fixing farm equipment. The metal gleamed dully in the afternoon sunlight. Jeremiah saw it too, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. "You don't have the courage," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Try me," Oscar replied, echoing the words he had spoken that night under the oak tree. They stared at each other for a long moment, and I held my breath, terrified of what might happen next. Then Jeremiah shrugged as if the whole confrontation was beneath his notice. "Fine," he said. "Keep your little princess safe for now. But this isn't over, Oscar. Not by a long shot." He walked away then, whistling as if he didn't have a care in the world. But I saw the way his hands shook slightly, saw the tension in his shoulders. Oscar's threat had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Oscar waited until Jeremiah was out of sight, then turned to me. "Get the potatoes," he said gently. "I'll wait right here." I retrieved the sack as quickly as possible, my hands trembling as I lifted it from the storage bin. When I emerged from the shed, Oscar was still standing guard, the wrench now tucked into his belt. "Thank you," I whispered. He nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "This isn't over, Gertrude. He meant what he said. We need to be careful." "What are we going to do?" "I don't know yet, but I promise you this: he will never hurt you again. Not while I'm alive to prevent it." As we walked back to the house together, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't facing it alone. Oscar knew the truth now, and despite his own struggles and uncertainties, he was willing to stand with me against Jeremiah's darkness. But neither of us could have predicted how far Jeremiah would go to maintain his power over our family. Neither of us understood that cornered predators are the most dangerous of all. The war between my brothers began in earnest after that day at the shed. It was a cold war fought with looks and silences and subtle acts of sabotage, but it was no less real for being unspoken. Oscar made good on his promise to protect me, positioning himself as my shadow whenever Jeremiah was near. And Jeremiah, frustrated by this new obstacle to his predations, began to plot his revenge. He started small, hiding Oscar's tools, so he would be late for work, spreading rumors about Oscar's reliability among the local farmers who hired him for seasonal labor, finding ways to make Oscar look careless or incompetent in front of our parents. But Oscar endured it all with stoic determination, never retaliating, never giving Jeremiah the excuse he was looking for to escalate their conflict. The tension in our house became suffocating. Meals were eaten in strained silence, broken only by George's innocent chatter and Albert's increasingly worried questions about why everyone seemed so upset all the time. Mama began to notice that something was wrong, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. "You boys are going to worry me into an early grave," she said one evening as she mended a tear in one of Papa's work shirts. "Walking around here like you're attending a funeral instead of living with your family." "Just tired, Mama," Jeremiah said with that perfect smile of his. "Hard work takes its toll." "Maybe you need some time off," she suggested. "Both of you. Maybe a fishing trip down to Miller's Creek would do you good." The idea of Jeremiah and Oscar spending time alone together, especially in a remote location, filled me with dread. Oscar must have felt the same way because he quickly demurred. "Too much work to be done here," he said. Harvest season's coming up, and the Hendersons need help with their tobacco. Mama sighed, clearly disappointed by their lack of enthusiasm for her suggestion. Well, maybe things will improve once the weather breaks. This heat makes everyone irritable. If only it were that simple. If only our problems could be solved by a change in the weather instead of a change in human nature. As summer gave way to early fall, I began to notice changes in myself as well. The constant stress and fear had taken their toll on my body and mind. I had lost weight, my clothes hanging loose on my frame. My hair, once thick and shiny, had become dull and brittle. At school, I struggled to concentrate on even the simplest lessons, my mind always elsewhere, always watchful for the next threat. Miss Ordway grew increasingly concerned about my decline. She kept me after class more frequently, ostensibly, to help with my studies, but really, I think to try to understand what was troubling me. She lent me books she thought might interest me, stories of brave heroines who overcame impossible odds, tales of young women who found their own strength in the face of adversity. Reading can be a refuge, she told me one afternoon as she handed me a copy of Jane Eyre. When the world becomes too difficult to bear, we can lose ourselves in stories of others who have faced similar challenges and emerged victorious. I treasured those books, reading them by lamplight long after everyone else had gone to sleep. In the pages of those novels, I found glimpses of the life I dreamed of, having a life where women could be strong and independent, where they could speak their truth without fear, where justice eventually prevailed over cruelty. But books, however comforting, couldn't change my reality. And my reality was about to become even more complicated. It happened on a crisp October morning, just as the leaves were beginning to turn gold and red. I woke to the sound of angry voices from the kitchen. Mama's voice raised in anguish, Papa's deep rumble of fury. Heart pounding, I scrambled from my mat and crept toward the source of the commotion. The scene that greeted me will be burned into my memory until the day I die. Mama was on her knees beside the kitchen table, her hands clutching a small wooden box, the same box where she kept our family's emergency fund, hidden beneath a loose floorboard for safekeeping. The box was open empty, its contents vanished as if they had never existed. 3 years' worth of savings. Mama sobbed, her voice breaking with each word. 3 years of putting aside every penny we could spare. The money for your grandmother's medicine, for Albert's school books, for winter clothes for the children. She couldn't finish, overcome by the magnitude of the loss. That money had represented security, hope, the difference between mere survival and something approaching prosperity. It was the fund that would keep us fed if Papa got sick, that would pay for the doctor if one of us was hurt, that would buy the small luxuries, a Christmas orange, a hair ribbon, a book that made our hard life bearable. Papa stood over her, his face carved from granite, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I had never seen him so angry, so absolutely furious. The veins in his neck stood out like cords, and his breathing was harsh and labored. "Oh, who?" he asked, though his eyes were already searching for the answer, already focusing on the most likely suspect. Who knew where the money was hidden? We all knew, of course. It was supposed to be the family's secret, our collective security against disaster. Each of us had been sworn to secrecy, taught that the emergency fund was sacrosanct, never to be touched, except in the most dire circumstances. The sound of footsteps on the porch announced the arrival of the rest of my brothers, drawn by the commotion. Albert appeared first, his hair tousled from sleep, followed by little George, who immediately began to cry at the sight of Mama's distress. Oscar came last, taking in the scene with those observant eyes of his. I saw understanding dawn on his face, saw his jaw tighten with anger, and something that might have been fear. That's when Jeremiah walked into the kitchen. He looked different this morning, clean-shaven, his hair slicked back with pomade, wearing his best shirt and carrying a canvas traveling bag. He moved with the confident stride of a man with places to go and plans to execute. When he saw us all gathered around the empty money box, he paused in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to something that might have been guilt if I hadn't known better. "What's all the fuss about?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Papa turned to face his oldest son, and I saw something terrible in his eyes. Not just anger, but disappointment so profound, it was like looking at a broken man. "Going somewhere, son?" Papa asked, his tone deceptively calm. Jeremiah shrugged, hefting his bag higher on his shoulder. "Thought I might visit Uncle Frank and Charlotte. Look for better work opportunities. The mill here doesn't pay enough for a man with ambitions." "With what money?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even George stopped crying, sensing the gravity of the moment. Jeremiah's mask of innocence slipped for just an instant, revealing the arrogant sneer beneath. "With my money," he said finally, his voice taking on a defiant edge. "Money I earned with my own 2 hands, working longer hours than anyone else in this family." "That money belongs to this family," Mama cried, struggling to her feet with Albert's help. "It's for your sick grandmother, for your brother's education, for emergencies. It's for whatever I say it's for." Jeremiah cut her off, his mask dropping completely now. "I'm the only one in this house bringing in real wages. I'm the one Papa relies on at the mill. I'm the one who keeps this family afloat while the rest of you live off my labor. I've earned the right to make my own decisions." The cruelty of his words hit Mama like physical blows. She stumbled backward, one hand pressed to her heart, her face pale with shock. Papa moved toward Jeremiah, his fists raised, but stopped when Oscar stepped between them. "Give it back," Oscar said quietly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Jeremiah laughed, that cold sound I had learned to fear. "Or what little brother you'll make me." "If I have to." They faced each other across the kitchen, and I could feel the weight of all their accumulated hatred and resentment crackling in the air between them. This was the moment their Cold War would turn hot, the moment when years of suppressed violence would finally erupt. "You think you're man enough to stop me?" Jeremiah taunted. "You think you have what it takes to stand up to your betters? I think," Oscar said carefully, "that you're about to find out." That's when Jeremiah made his fatal mistake. Instead of accepting Oscar's challenge, instead of settling their differences with fists like men, he chose to fight with the one weapon he knew would hurt most, the truth. "You want to know where your precious money really went?" he said, turning to address the whole family. "Ask Gertrude. Ask her what she's been doing to earn it." Every pair of eyes in the room turned to me, and I felt like a deer caught in an open field with wolves circling. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet, and I had to grab the doorframe to keep from falling. "What's he talking about, child?" Papa asked, confusion and growing alarm evident in his voice. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. This was the moment I had been dreading for months, the moment when all my secrets would be dragged into the light. I could see the questions forming in my parents' eyes, could see Albert's growing understanding, and George's innocent confusion. "Tell them, Trudy," Jeremiah said, his voice sickeningly sweet. "Tell them about our special games in the shed. Tell them how you begged for it, how you cried and pleaded for more." The words hit me like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. I heard Mama gasp, saw Papa's face go slack with shock and horror. Little George began to cry again, not understanding what was happening, but sensing the terrible wrongness of it all. But it was Albert's reaction that broke my heart. My younger brother, only 13 years old, but wise beyond his years, went pale as death as understanding dawned. I saw him mouth the word no, silently, saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. "You lying piece of," Oscar started toward Jeremiah, but our older brother was ready for him. "Ah, lying." Jeremiah's laugh was pure venom. Look at her face and tell me I'm lying. She wanted it, begged for it every single time. Didn't you, Trudy? Tell them how you— He never finished the sentence. Oscar's fist connected with his jaw with a sound like breaking timber. Jeremiah staggered backward, crashed into the kitchen table, and went down hard among the scattered remains of our breakfast dishes. But he didn't stay down. With a roar of rage that seemed to shake the very walls of our house, he launched himself at Oscar, and the two of them went rolling across the floor in a tangle of flailing limbs and murderous intent. "Stop it!" Mama screamed, her voice rising above the sounds of violence. "Stop it right now!" But they were beyond hearing, beyond reason. This wasn't the playful wrestling of children, or even the serious scuffles of adolescent boys establishing dominance. This was pure, deadly combat between two young men who wanted nothing more than to destroy each other. They rolled across the kitchen floor, smashing chairs, overturning the water bucket, sending our few precious dishes flying in all directions. Jeremiah was taller and had more reach, but Oscar was stockier and powered by a righteous fury that made him seem almost superhuman. Papa tried to separate them, grabbing Oscar's arm and attempting to pull him away, but Oscar shook him off without even looking. Albert wrapped his arms around George, shielding our youngest brother from the violence, while Mama pressed herself against the wall and wept. And I stood frozen in the doorway, watching my family tear itself apart, knowing that I was the cause of it all. The fight seemed to last forever, but it probably only continued for a few minutes before the moment that changed everything. They had rolled near the stove, where Mama's heavy cast-iron skillet sat cooling after breakfast. In the confusion and fury of combat, I saw Oscar's hand close around the skillet's handle. "No," I screamed, but it was too late. The skillet connected with Jeremiah's skull with a wet, sickening sound that I will hear echoing in my nightmares for the rest of my life. My oldest brother's eyes rolled back in his head, showing only white, and he crumpled to the floor like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Blood, so much blood, began to pool beneath his head, soaking into the rough wooden planks of our kitchen floor. It was bright red at first, then gradually darkening to the color of rust as it congealed. Oscar stood over him, the bloody skillet still clutched in his white-knuckled fist, his chest heaving with exertion and shock. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. We all just stared at the impossible scene before us. Jeremiah lying motionless in a spreading pool of his own blood, his golden hair matted with gore. Then Mama started screaming. The sound that came from her throat was barely human, a wail of anguish and terror that seemed to contain all the grief in the world. She fell to her knees beside Jeremiah's still form, her hands hovering over him, as if she wanted to touch him, but was afraid of what she might find. "Is he?" Albert whispered, his voice barely audible over Mama's cries. Oscar dropped the skillet with a clatter that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. He stared down at his hands as if he had never seen them before, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. "I don't know," he said quietly. "God help me, I don't know." But somehow, we all did know. There was something about the absolute stillness of Jeremiah's body, the unnatural angle of his head, the way the light seemed to have gone out of his eyes, even though they remained open. Death had visited the Jenkins household, and nothing would ever be the same. Papa knelt beside Mama, pressing his ear to Jeremiah's chest, feeling for a pulse at his throat. After what seemed like an eternity, he looked up at us with an expression of infinite sadness. "He's gone," he said simply. The words fell into the silence like stones into a deep well. Mama's screams became sobs, great heaving sounds that shook her entire body. George began to cry again, not fully understanding what death meant, but sensing its finality. Albert just stood there, his arms still protectively around our youngest brother, his face a mask of shock and grief. And Oscar walked to the kitchen door, opened it, and stepped out into the morning sunlight. "Where are you going?" Papa called after him. Away, came the answer, drifting back to us on the autumn breeze. Far away. Those were the last words any of us heard from Oscar for 20 years. The hours that followed passed in a blur of chaos and bureaucracy. The sheriff came, asked his questions, wrote his report in a small leather notebook with a stubby pencil. Accidental death during a family altercation, he concluded. Tragic, but these things happen sometimes in poor families, where desperation ran deep and tempers ran hotter. Dr. Morrison arrived to examine the body and pronounce Jeremiah officially dead. He was a kind man, gentle in his handling of both the corpse and the grieving family, but there was nothing he could do to ease the weight of what had happened. Head trauma. He explained to Papa in the quiet professional tones of a man who had seen too much death in his long career. He would have died instantly. No pain, if that's any comfort. It wasn't really. Pain might have been preferable to the terrible emptiness that had settled over our house like a shroud. Neighbors began to arrive as word of the tragedy spread. Mrs. Henderson with a covered dish, the Reverend Pike with his worn Bible, and inadequate words of comfort other Mill families who understood the particular hardships that could drive a family to such extremes. None of them asked about the fight itself, about what had driven two brothers to such violence. Some truths were too ugly to be spoken aloud, too devastating to be examined closely. It was easier for everyone involved to accept the official version of family quarrel that had gotten out of hand, a terrible accident that could have happened to anyone under similar circumstances. But I noticed the way people looked at me, the sideways glances and whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Jeremiah's final words had been heard by everyone present, and while most people chose to dismiss them as the ravings of a desperate man, some seeds of suspicion had been planted. The funeral was held 3 days later, a simple graveside service at the Baptist Church Cemetery. The preacher spoke about forgiveness and the mysterious ways of the Lord, but his words felt hollow in the face of so much pain and confusion. I stood beside Mama in my one good dress, the blue one she had sewn for me the previous Christmas, and tried to feel something appropriate to the occasion. Grief, perhaps, or guilt, or even relief. But there was only emptiness, a vast, hollow space where my emotions used to live. As they lowered Jeremiah's pine coffin into the red clay soil of North Carolina, I found myself thinking about the boy he had been before the darkness claimed him. The brother who had carried me on his shoulders, who had taught me to whistle, who had once spent his last nickel buying me a hair ribbon just to see me smile. Where had that boy gone? When had he been replaced by the monster who had tormented me in the shadows of our shed? I would spend years wondering about that transformation, trying to understand how love could curdle into something so poisonous. But on that crisp October afternoon, watching them cover my brother's grave with shovelfuls of earth, I felt only a profound sense of loss, not just for Jeremiah, but for the family we had been before secrets and shame tore us apart. After the funeral, we returned to our house to find it transformed. Without Jeremiah's presence, without the constant tension between him and Oscar, the place felt different, emptier, quieter, but also somehow cleaner, as if a toxic presence had been removed. That evening, as we sat around our kitchen table for the first time since the tragedy, Papa cleared his throat and spoke the words that would reshape our family forever. Things are going to be different now, he said, his voice gravelly with exhaustion and grief. We've lost our 2 biggest wage earners, and my work at the mill isn't steady enough to support us all. Some changes need to be made. He looked at each of us in turn, Mama with her red-rimmed eyes and hollow cheeks, Albert trying so hard to be the man of the family. At 13, George still young enough to believe that everything would somehow return to normal, and me, the girl whose secrets had helped destroy everything. Albert. Papa continued, "You're going to have to take on more responsibilities around here. You're the oldest now, and I'm going to need your help keeping this family together." Albert straightened his shoulders and nodded with a gravity that broke my heart. Yes, sir. I understand. And George, Papa's voice softened as he looked at our youngest brother. George, you just keep being the good boy you are. Study hard in school, mind your mama, and try not to worry too much about things that are beyond your control. Finally, his gaze settled on me, and I saw something there I couldn't quite identify. Not blame exactly, but a kind of resigned sadness, as if he understood more than he was willing to acknowledge. Gertrude, he said carefully, Miss Ordway came by yesterday while we were at the cemetery. She wants to see you tomorrow after school. Says it's important. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. What could Miss Ordway possibly want at a time like this? Surely she had heard about what happened about the accusations Jeremiah had made in his final moments. Was she going to ask me to leave school? Was she going to demand the truth about what had really transpired between my brother and me? The uncertainty gnawed at me through a sleepless night and a distracted day at school. My classmates treated me with the careful politeness reserved for the recently bereaved, but I caught the same sideways glances I had noticed from the adults, the same whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. When the final bell rang, I made my way to Miss Ordway's classroom with leaden feet. She was waiting for me at her desk, her kind face grave with concern, and something that might have been determination. Sit down, Gertrude, she said, gently gesturing to the chair beside her desk. We need to talk. I perched on the edge of the seat, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, bracing myself for questions I wasn't sure I could answer. Am I in trouble, Miss Ordway? Trouble? She seemed genuinely surprised by the question. Child, you're the furthest thing from trouble I can imagine. No, I asked you here because I have something to tell you, something that might change your life. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with an excitement that seemed incongruous given the circumstances of our meeting. I've been corresponding with my former teacher, Mrs. Catherine Ellington, who now runs the Richmond Academy for Young Ladies in Virginia. It's a prestigious institution that prepares girls for college or teaching careers, a place where bright young women can develop their minds and discover their potential. I stared at her, not quite understanding where this conversation was leading. I've told Mrs. Ellington about you, Miss Ordway continued, about your exceptional writing abilities, your quick mind, your hunger for learning, about how you devour every book I give you and always come back asking for more. Yes, ma'am, I said uncertainly. She's interested in meeting you, Gertrude. Very interested. In fact, she's prepared to offer you something extraordinary, a full scholarship to the Richmond Academy. Room, board, tuition, everything. You could leave Milltown behind and build a new life for yourself. A better life. The words hit me like physical blows. Leave Milltown. Leave my family. It seemed impossible, unthinkable. I couldn't, I stammered. My family needs me. After what happened, your family needs you to succeed, Miss Ordway interrupted firmly. They need you to break the cycle of poverty and tragedy that has trapped them for generations. You have a gift, child, a brilliant mind, and a way with words that could take you anywhere you want to go. Don't waste it on guilt or misplaced loyalty. She reached across the desk and took my hands in hers, her touch warm and reassuring. I know something terrible has been happening to you, Gertrude. I've seen the signs, the fear in your eyes, the way you've withdrawn from your friends, the decline in your schoolwork. I don't know the details, and you don't have to tell me if you're not ready. But I know that whatever happened, it wasn't your fault. Tears began to roll down my cheeks, the first real tears I had shed since that horrible morning in the kitchen. But what if it was, I whispered, what if I did something to cause it? What if I'm not the kind of girl who deserves a chance like this? Miss Ordway's grip on my hands tightened. Listen to me very carefully, Gertrude Jenkins. You are not responsible for the actions of others. You are not responsible for their choices, their violence, their sickness. You were a child trying to survive in an impossible situation, and you did nothing to deserve what was done to you. Her words penetrated the wall of shame and self-blame I had built around my heart, offering the first glimpse of light I had seen in months. "The Richmond Academy expects an answer within 2 weeks," she continued. "I know it's a big decision, especially with everything your family is going through. But promise me you'll consider it. Promise me you won't let fear or guilt trap you in a life smaller than the one you're meant to live." She released my hands and picked up a leather-bound journal from her desk. It was beautiful soft brown leather, with my initials embossed in gold on the cover, the pages inside creamy white and smooth as silk. "This is for you," she said, placing it in my hands. "I want you to start writing not just school compositions, but your own thoughts, your own story. Words have power, child. They can heal wounds that nothing else can touch. And someday, when you're ready, your story might help other girls who find themselves in similar situations." I clutched the journal to my chest like a lifeline. "I promise I'll consider the school, and I'll write every day." "Good." Miss Ordway smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from an adult since Jeremiah's death. "You're going to do wonderful things, Gertrude. I know it might not feel that way now, but you're going to change the world." That night, I sat in my corner behind the faded curtain and opened the journal to its first blank page. For a long time, I just stared at it, overwhelmed by the possibilities it represented. Then slowly, I began to write. "My name is Gertrude Ann Jenkins, and I am 12 years old. I don't know yet who I'm going to become, but I know who I don't want to be. I don't want to be a victim. I don't want to be afraid. I don't want to let the darkness in other people's hearts become the darkness in my own." Today, my teacher offered me a chance to leave this place and start over somewhere new. The idea terrifies me, but it also fills me with something I had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. I don't know if I'm brave enough to take such a leap. I don't know if I deserve the chance I'm being offered. But I know that if I stay here, if I let fear and shame keep me trapped in this small life, then Jeremiah will have won. He will have succeeded in destroying not just my innocence, but my future as well. I won't let that happen. Whatever it takes, whatever courage I have to find, I won't let him win. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And sometimes I was learning beginnings are enough. Over the next 2 weeks, I wrote in that journal every night, pouring my heart onto those pristine pages. I wrote about the terror and the shame, but also about the moments of beauty that had sustained me through the darkness. Mama's stories about the buttons, Miss Ordway's kindness, the feel of morning sunlight on my face after a night of nightmares. I wrote about Jeremiah trying to understand how the brother who had once carried me on his shoulders had become someone who could hurt me so deeply. I wrote about Oscar, whose final act of violence had in its terrible way set me free from my tormentor, but condemned him to a lifetime of exile and guilt. And I wrote about the choice that lay before me, the chance to escape, to reinvent myself, to become someone new in a place where no one knew the Jenkins family's secrets. The decision, when it finally came, felt inevitable. I couldn't stay in Milltown, couldn't continue to live in the shadow of what had happened. But I also couldn't leave without ensuring that my younger brothers would be safe, that the cycle of violence and abuse that had claimed Jeremiah wouldn't claim them as well. The night before I was to give Miss Ordway my answer, I gathered Albert and George in our small kitchen, the same room where our family had been torn apart, but also where Mama had taught me to read, where Papa had told us stories on winter evenings, where we had shared countless simple meals and moments of love. "I need to tell you boys something." I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "About what really happened between Jeremiah and me. About why Oscar did what he did." Albert, wise beyond his 13 years, nodded solemnly. "I thought it might be something like that. The way Jeremiah looked at you sometimes, the things he said before Oscar stopped him." George, still only 10, looked confused, but trusting. "What are you talking about, Gertrude?" So I told them. Not everything, they were still children after all, but enough. Enough for them to understand that Jeremiah had been sick in a way that made him dangerous, especially to those smaller and weaker than himself. Enough for them to understand that what Oscar had done, while terrible, had been done to protect me. The reason I'm telling you this, I continued taking their hands in mine, is because I've been offered a chance to go to school in Richmond. A good school that could give me a future I never dreamed of. But I can't go unless I know you boys will be safe. Unless I know you'll look out for each other the way Oscar looked out for me. Albert squeezed my hand tightly. "We will," he promised, his young voice filled with a determination that reminded me painfully of Oscar. "I won't let anything bad happen to George, or to myself. I swear it on Jeremiah's grave." George nodded solemnly, though I could see he didn't fully understand the weight of what we were discussing. "Will you come back to visit?" "Every chance I get," I promised, pulling them both into a fierce hug. "And I'll write to you constantly. You'll be so tired of my letters, you'll beg me to stop." "Never," Albert said firmly. "We'll never get tired of hearing from you." The next morning, I walked to the schoolhouse with my answer for Miss Ordway. Richmond, Virginia felt as far away as the moon, but I was ready to reach for it. "I'll go," I told her simply. Her face lit up like sunrise after the longest night. "Oh, Gertrude, you won't regret this decision. I know it feels frightening now, but you're going to do wonderful things. You're going to soar." As I walked home that afternoon, I passed the shed where my nightmare had begun. For a moment, I hesitated, then pushed open the door and stepped inside. The space looked smaller than I remembered, more ordinary. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the boards, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden air. "I forgive you," I whispered to the ghost of my brother. "Not because you deserved it, but because I deserve to be free." Then I walked away from that place forever, leaving the darkness behind and stepping into whatever light awaited me. 3 weeks later, I stood on the platform of the Milltown train station with a single battered suitcase and Mama's precious button box clutched in my arms. She had insisted I take it with me despite my protests. Every button has a story. She reminded me, tears streaming down her face. "And now you're going to collect your own stories. Beautiful stories. Stories worthy of the finest buttons in the finest shops." Papa, awkward with emotion, as always, pressed a small leather pouch into my hand. "It's not much," he muttered, unable to meet my eyes. "Just what I could scrape together from my pay. For emergencies." Inside the pouch were $5 more money than I had ever held at one time, a fortune by our family's standards. The sacrifice it represented brought fresh tears to my eyes. I hugged them both, breathed in the familiar scents of Mama's lavender soap and Papa's pipe tobacco, and tried to memorize the feel of their arms around me. Albert and George stood nearby, trying to be brave, but unable to hide their tears. "Take care of each other," I whispered. "You take care of yourself," Mama whispered back. "And remember, you're not just carrying your own hopes with you. You're carrying ours too." The train whistle blew loud and mournful as a ghost cry. I climbed aboard, found a seat by the window, and watched my family grow smaller and smaller as the train pulled away from everything I'd ever known. But as the familiar landmarks of Milltown disappeared behind me, I didn't feel the grief I'd expected. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Pure, undiluted hope for the future that stretched ahead of me like an unwritten page. The Richmond Academy for Young Ladies was everything Miss Ordway had promised and more. Situated on a tree-lined avenue in one of the city's most elegant neighborhoods, it was a world away from the poverty and hardship I had known in Milltown. The buildings were made of red brick and white stone, with tall windows that let in streams of golden light. The grounds were carefully manicured with flower gardens and walking paths that invited contemplation and study. My fellow students came from prosperous families throughout Virginia and the surrounding states, young women who spoke with cultured accents and wore dresses that cost more than my father made in a year. At first, I felt like an imposter among them, certain that at any moment someone would discover I was just a mill worker's daughter pretending to belong in such refined company. But Mrs. Ellington, a formidable woman with silver hair and kind eyes, took me under her wing from the very first day. She had founded the academy with the revolutionary belief that women's minds were every bit as capable as men's, and that with proper education and encouragement, young ladies could achieve anything they set their hearts on. Mère, intelligence and character, she told me during our first private meeting, are far more valuable than wealth or social standing. You have both in abundance, Miss Jenkins. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. I threw myself into my studies with a hunger that amazed my teachers. Literature, history, mathematics, languages I devoured, knowledge like a starving person devours bread. For the first time in my life, I was in an environment where learning was celebrated, where curiosity was encouraged, where a girl's dreams were taken seriously. In the evenings, after my classmates had retired to their rooms for social visits and letter writing, I would sit at my small desk by the window and continue writing in the journal Miss Ordway had given me. The words poured out of me, poetry stories, essays about justice and healing and the power of speaking truth. Some of my pieces were published in the Academy's literary magazine and later in regional publications that Mrs. Ellington submitted them to. Slowly, I began to understand that Miss Ordway had been right. Words did have power. They could transform pain into purpose, shame into strength, silence into a voice that could change the world. Throughout my years at the Academy, I maintained a steady correspondence with my family. Albert had indeed taken over the role of protective older brother, with remarkable maturity, ensuring that George stayed in school and out of trouble. Papa had found more consistent work at a larger textile mill in the next county, and Mama's sewing business had grown to include several of the town's wealthiest families. They were healing piece by piece, just as I was. The wound that Jeremiah's death had left in our family would never fully close, but we were learning to live with the scar, to find meaning and purpose in the pain we had endured. In my final year at the Academy, something extraordinary happened. I received a letter postmarked from Buenos Aires, Argentina, written in handwriting that was achingly familiar despite the years that had passed since I'd last seen it. The envelope was expensive cream-colored paper, with my name written in Oscar's careful script. Inside, on hotel stationery embossed with gold lettering, was a single page that would change my understanding of everything. Dearest Trudy, I know I have no right to write to you after so many years of silence. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness or even your attention. But I heard from Albert that you're about to graduate from the Academy with highest honors, and I couldn't let this milestone pass without telling you how proud I am of what you've become. I've spent the last 6 years working on merchant ships traveling the world, trying to outrun the demons that followed me from Milltown. I've seen the most beautiful places on earth, the fjords of Norway, the temples of India, the endless pampas of Argentina, but none of them could erase the memory of what I did, not just that terrible morning in our kitchen, but all the months before it, when I chose cowardice over courage, complicity over protection. I need you to know that I never forgot you. Not for a single day. Every sunrise I watched from a ship's deck reminded me of the light in your eyes that I failed to protect. Every storm I weathered reminded me of the tempest that raged in our house while I stood by and did nothing. Most of all, I need you to know that what Jeremiah did to you was not your fault. You were a child, innocent and trusting, and we both, Jeremiah and I, betrayed that trust in the most horrible ways imaginable. He by acting on his sickness, and I by failing to stop him soon enough. But here's the thing I've learned in my years of exile. Your courage, your refusal to let what happened destroy you, your determination to build something beautiful from the ruins of our family has been the one bright star in the darkness of my wandering. Knowing that you survived, that you thrived, that you became someone extraordinary despite everything we put you through, it's given me the strength to start trying to become someone better myself. I'm learning Spanish. I'm learning to read and write properly thanks to an Irish priest I met in Montevideo who took pity on an ignorant sailor. I have a job managing a small ranch outside Buenos Aires, and I'm saving money to buy land of my own someday. I'll never be the brother you deserved, but maybe I can become a man worthy of calling himself your brother. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect a response to this letter. But I needed you to know that somewhere in the world, someone who once failed you completely is spending every day trying to earn the right to remember you with pride instead of shame. Be well, Trudy. Be happy. And know that your strength has inspired more healing than you could ever imagine. With all my love and deepest regret, Oscar. P.S. I've enclosed a small gift button made from South American jade that reminded me of Mama's sewing box. Perhaps it can join the collection of stories you're building for yourself. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Not tears of pain this time, but of profound relief and something that might have been joy. All these years, I had carried the weight of wondering what had become of Oscar, whether he was alive or dead, whether he had found peace or been consumed by guilt. Now I knew. He was alive, he was healing, and incredibly my survival had played a part in his redemption. I sat down at my desk that very night and wrote my reply. My dearest Oscar, your letter found me on the eve of my graduation as I prepare to begin the next chapter of my life as a teacher. The timing feels significant, as if the universe wanted to remind me that healing is possible for all of us, no matter how deep our wounds or how dark our past mistakes. You ask for forgiveness, but I gave you that years ago. Not because you asked for it, but because carrying hatred was too heavy a burden for me to bear. I forgave you so that I could be free to love, to trust, to build a life unmarked by bitterness. But more than forgiveness, I want to give you something else, absolution. You were 17 years old, trapped in an impossible situation, trying to navigate choices no young person should ever have to make. You were not the monster in our story, Oscar. You were another victim who found the courage to stand up when it mattered most. What you did that morning in our kitchen was not murder. It was salvation. Not just mine, but Albert's and George's too. Jeremiah's sickness was growing worse, and I shudder to think what other horrors might have followed if you hadn't stopped him when you did. I'm proud of the man you're becoming in Argentina. I'm proud of your courage in starting over, in building something good from the ashes of our tragedy. And I want you to know that you will always be my brother. Not because we share blood, but because when the moment came to choose between right and wrong, you chose right. The jade button is beautiful, and it will hold a place of honor in Mama's collection. But more precious than any button is the knowledge that you're alive, that you're healing, that the cycle of violence that claimed Jeremiah ends with our generation. Come home when you're ready, Oscar. Our family is still broken, but we're learning how to be whole again. There's room at our table for a prodigal son who's ready to forgive himself. With all my love and deepest respect, Gertrude. P.S. I'm enclosing a photograph from my graduation ceremony and a copy of my first published essay. Mama insists you should see how your little sister turned out. I sealed the letter with wax from a candle Mrs. Ellington had given me, then walked through the quiet streets of Richmond to the post office. The spring air was soft and warm, filled with the scent of blooming dogwood trees, and I felt lighter than I had in years. Some stories I was learning have more than one ending. Some wounds, given enough time and love and careful tending can transform into wisdom. And some families, no matter how badly broken, can find their way back to each other through the simple act of refusing to give up on love. The final chapter of my academy years culminated in my acceptance to Hollins College with a full scholarship to study English literature and education. Mrs. Ellington wept openly at my graduation ceremony, proclaiming to anyone who would listen that I was living proof of her belief in the unlimited potential of young women. But even as I celebrated this milestone, my heart was already turning toward home. I had spent 4 years building myself into someone new, someone strong enough to return to North Carolina without being overwhelmed by the ghosts that lived there. I was ready to begin the work I had been preparing for, not just teaching children to read and write, but helping them find their own voices, their own paths to freedom. Miss Ordway had retired the previous spring, and the Milltown School Board had offered me her position. It felt like a homecoming that had been written in the stars, the frightened girl who had once sat in those very desks, returning as a woman with the power to protect other children from the darkness she had known. On a warm September morning in 1958, I walked into that familiar classroom for the first time as Miss Jenkins, the new teacher. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, the world map on the wall, the afternoon light slanting through tall windows, the smell of chalk dust and old books that had welcomed generations of mountain children. But I was different. The terrified girl who had once trembled at Jeremiah's voice had become a woman with purpose and power, armed with knowledge and experience, and an unshakable determination to use both in service of those who needed protection most. My first class included several children from families I'd known all my life, as well as newcomers drawn to Milltown by the expansion of the textile mills. Among them was a thin, quiet girl named Sarah, whose haunted eyes reminded me painfully of my own younger self. It didn't take long to recognize the signs I now knew so well, the way she flinched from unexpected touch. The baggy clothes that hid her developing body, the way she seemed to disappear into herself whenever certain topics came up in our discussions. During recess, while other children played, she would sit alone with the book-building walls of solitude around herself. One afternoon, I asked her to stay after school. She approached my desk with the careful wariness of a wild animal that had learned to expect cruelty from human hands. "Am I in trouble, Miss Jenkins?" she asked nervously, twisting her hands in her lap. "Not at all, Sarah. I just wanted to talk to you about your essay on my hero. You wrote about Joan of Arc, a very interesting choice for a girl your age." She nodded, still wary. I liked that she was brave, that she fought for what was right even when everyone said she was wrong. "That takes tremendous courage." I agreed. Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are the ones closest to home. Sometimes the people we need to be brave with are the ones who are supposed to love us most. Something flickered in her eyes, recognition perhaps, or hope. "Miss Jenkins." "Yes, dear." If someone was doing something bad to a person and that person was afraid to tell because they thought nobody would believe them, what should they do? My heart ached for this child who was walking the same dark path I had once traveled. But this time, I could be the adult I had needed and never had. "They should tell someone they trust," I said carefully. "A teacher maybe, or a neighbor, or a friend's parent. And if the first person doesn't believe them, they should tell someone else. They should keep telling until someone listens and helps." But what if the bad person is in their family? What if telling would make everything worse? I knelt down so we were eye to eye, my hands gently covering hers. Sarah listened to me very carefully. It is never a child's fault when an adult hurts them. Never. And it's not a child's job to protect adults from the consequences of their bad choices. A child's only job is to be safe and loved and allowed to grow up in peace. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, the same helpless tears I had shed so many years ago. "My mama needs my daddy's money from the mill. If I tell and he gets in trouble, your mama needs you safe more than she needs his money." I said firmly. And there are people who can help ways to make sure your family doesn't suffer for doing the right thing. It took 3 more conversations over 2 weeks, but eventually Sarah found the courage to tell me everything. Her father, like Jeremiah, had convinced her that she was somehow responsible for his actions, that speaking up would destroy their family. With Sarah's permission, I contacted Reverend Pike, who in turn reached out to the appropriate authorities. Sarah's father was arrested and eventually sentenced to 5 years in prison. Her mother, initially angry and disbelieving, eventually came to understand the truth and sought help from the church and community to support her family during the transition. Sarah stayed in my class for 2 more years before her mother remarried a kind man from Asheville and they moved to start fresh. But in those 2 years, I watched her transform from a frightened, withdrawn child into a bright, confident young girl who spoke up in class, made friends, and carried herself with the dignity of someone who knew she was valued and protected. On her last day, she brought me a small wrapped gift, a button made of carved ivory shaped like a tiny rose. "My grandmother gave this to me," she said. "She told me it came from a dress worn by a very brave lady a long time ago. I want you to have it because you taught me how to be brave too." I added that button to Mama's collection, and every time I looked at it, I was reminded that our stories, our pain, and our healing can become bridges to help others cross their own dark waters. The years that followed were full and rich, marked by the gradual rebuilding of my family and the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered. I married a good man named Thomas McKenna, a widowed shopkeeper who appreciated my intelligence and shared my passion for social justice. We had 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son, whom I raised with fierce protectiveness and unconditional love. I continued teaching for 30 years, touching the lives of hundreds of children, always watching for the signs I knew too well, always ready to be the voice of protection and advocacy that I had needed as a child. In that time, I helped save a dozen children from situations similar to the one I had endured, each rescue validating my belief that speaking truth, however painful, was the only way to break cycles of abuse and silence. Albert grew up to become a successful businessman and pillar of our community, never forgetting his promise to protect those smaller and weaker than himself. He married a teacher from the next county and had 4 children of his own, all of whom grew up knowing they were cherished and safe. He often told me that the lessons he learned during those dark months after Jeremiah's death, about standing up for the innocent, about the courage required to do what's right, had shaped everything good about the man he became. George became a lawyer specializing in cases involving child welfare and family law. He never married, dedicating his life instead to justice for those who couldn't fight for themselves. He once told me that his earliest clear memory wasn't of Jeremiah's violence or Oscar's exile, but of the way our family had ultimately chosen love over fear, healing over hatred. Papa worked at the mill until his hands gave out, then spent his final years in a rocking chair on our front porch, telling stories to his grandchildren. He never spoke directly about what had happened to our family, but sometimes I caught him looking at me with eyes full of pride and something that might have been apology. Mama continued sewing almost until the day she died at 78, her button box remaining a treasure trove of stories and memories. When she passed, she left me that precious collection with a note, "For my daughter who learned to sew the most beautiful life from the darkest scraps." Oscar did eventually come home 15 years after his exile, a changed man with silver in his hair and wisdom earned through hard experience. He had built a successful ranch in Argentina and married a kind woman named Isabella, who understood that some men carry scars that never fully heal, but can learn to wear them with dignity. He attended Thomas's funeral when my husband died of pneumonia at 62. He held my hand during Mama's service and walked with me through the cemetery where Jeremiah lay buried beneath a simple stone. We stood together at our brother's grave for a long time, not speaking, but somehow finally making peace with the ghosts that had haunted us both. "Do you think he's at rest?" Oscar asked quietly. "I think we all are," I replied. "Finally." Oscar became the uncle my children had always deserved, teaching my son to fish and hunt, telling my daughters stories of far-off places and foreign customs. We never spoke directly about what had happened in our childhood. Some truths are too deep for words, but we didn't need to. Some forgiveness transcends language. When Oscar died in his 70s, peacefully in his sleep after a long and productive life, I spoke at his funeral about redemption and second chances. About how the worst moments of our lives can become the foundation for our greatest strengths if we have the courage to build something beautiful from the rubble. Now at 83, I sit in my comfortable home in Atlanta, surrounded by photographs of children and grandchildren who have never known fear in their own homes, never wondered if the people who were supposed to protect them might be the ones they most needed protection from. The button box sits on my kitchen table, where it has sat every day for the past 20 years, still full of stories, still reminding me that life is indeed made of scraps, some beautiful, some terrible, but all of them ours to arrange as we choose. I think often of Miss Ordway's words about the power of stories, the magic that lives in words honestly spoken. She was right, of course. This story, my story, has been my salvation. Not because telling it has erased the pain, but because sharing it has transformed that pain into purpose. Every year I speak to groups of teachers, social workers, and child advocates. I tell them what to look for, how to listen, when to act. I tell them that children who are being hurt often can't ask for help directly, but they will leave signs for those who know how to read them. And sometimes I speak directly to survivors. I tell them what I learned in that shed, in that kitchen, in the years of healing that followed. You are not responsible for the darkness in other people's hearts. You are not defined by what was done to you. You are not broken beyond repair. You are a story still being written, and you hold the pen. The buttons scatter across my table one final time, catching the last light of this autumn afternoon. Each one holds its story. Mrs. Whitmore's wedding dress, Mr. Jameson's vest, Mrs. Marlowe's evening gown, but they're all part of a larger tapestry. Now one that includes not just the pain of the past, but the healing that followed, the love that triumphed, and the hope that continues. I am Gertrude Ann Jenkins McKenna. I am 83 years old. I have loved and been loved. I have suffered and survived. I have taken the worst moments of my childhood and transformed them into a lifetime of protecting other children. I am no longer afraid. I am no longer ashamed. I am no longer a victim. I am living proof that broken things can be made beautiful again. That even the darkest scraps can be sewn into something worthy of light. As I close this story for the final time, I can hear my great-granddaughter playing in the garden outside my window. Safe, laughing, loved. The cycle of fear and silence that trapped my family for generations has been broken, replaced by openness, protection, and the unwavering belief that every child deserves to grow up surrounded by love rather than fear. Life is made of scraps, just as Mama said. But oh, what beautiful quilts we can make when we refuse to let the darkness define the pattern. The sun sets over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and I am at peace. My story is complete, my purpose fulfilled, my legacy secure in the lives of children who will grow up safe because someone else had the courage to speak truth into darkness. The buttons rest quietly in their box, each one a reminder that even the smallest pieces of our lives can be gathered together and made into something beautiful, something lasting, something worthy of the light.